Good morning. This is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness. And this presentation is part of a ongoing series on the evolution of science fiction, based on my book series, Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. And so far, 3 books have been published: Prometheus to the Martians, The Time Machine to Metropolis, and Superman to Star Maker. I've already done presentations on the Golden Age through the Silver Age, which have not been put into book form, but the videos are up on the video school. I'm actually moving through volume 5 now in the series, The New Wave, Star Wars, and Cyberpunk. And today's presentation is going to be on part 2 of the new culture and the new wave, 1964 to approximately 1980. Up on the screen there is a very famous work of science fiction art, and it was the cover for one of the editions of Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness. And the painting is by an artist by the name of Alex Ebel. And this is a very, I think, a great work of science fiction art, and also very symbolic, because it's a double face of a woman and a man that is actually representative of a key theme in that novel, which indeed was written during the 64-80 period in New Wave science fiction. And there'll be a few other examples of some interesting art that was produced during that time. And as I said, this is part 2. Just to go quickly back through part 1, which we did a few weeks back. I mentioned that even though the new wave in some ways was very innovative as a movement in science fiction, there were a number of antecedents of the new wave during the Silver Age. But the new wave did reflect an emerging counterculture of the 1960s, and it actually contributed into that counterculture, highlighting countercultural 1960s hippie themes like sex and drugs and music and the breaking of taboos and new artistic standards. I date the beginning of the new wave with Michael Moorcock taking over as editor of New Worlds, where Moorcock attempted to bring new themes, new standards, new writing styles into science fiction. And just like the counterculture rejected the values and mindsets of modern society, and science fiction new wave writing not only rejected the values and mindset of modern society, but traditional science fiction, in particular, the industrial techno-scientific vision of progress. But new wave also would attack as counterculture in the 1960s, had attacked the perceived patriarchy embedded within traditional science fiction as the counterculture, and one of its different aspects attacked the patriarchy of modern Western society. In fact, today we'll talk about that a lot more. The new wave was avant-garde, identifying with new ways of thinking and writing. It invented the term speculative fiction to broaden the whole notion of science fiction. It rejected the divide between science fiction and mainstream literature, and it was into literary inventiveness. Their ways of writing were distinctly different. Today, I'll give you some more examples. Just like from last time, I mentioned J.G. Ballard and the Atrocity Exhibition, which was an effort to create something in literary form much different from what science fiction writers had done before. And there was a focus on improving literary quality, that science fiction raised its standards of writing and the quality of writing. There was a contrast that developed, highlighted during the new wave, of the difference between soft science fiction that emphasized the psychological, that was new wave, versus hard science fiction, which presumably was the kind of science fiction people in general have been writing before. That's too much of an absolute black and white distinction. There was a lot of soft psychological science fiction going on before. Ballard invented the distinction between not exploring outer space, but rather exploring inner space. And there was liberation and creative destruction as a theme. New Wave brought with it a whole new slew of disasters and dystopias, because in part, New Wave writing and New Wave philosophy was that we needed to transcend the traditional, both in modern Western society as well as in science fiction. And to transcend means to destroy what was there before. Now, as just a quick introduction to what I'm going to do today. And by the way, there's another interesting piece of new wave science fiction art from Ursula Guen's The Lathe of Heaven, which I will talk about today too. I'm going to begin with a story, a personal story on psychology, gender, and science fiction. And then I'm going to talk about some of the hard science fiction, very good science fiction that was written during the new wave, highlighting three very important authors, Frederick Pohl and Larry Niven and Joe Haldeman. And then I'll talk about some other interesting writers who I didn't get to last time, David Gerald and Christopher Priest and Raphael Lafferty. And then I'll highlight out to bring in some more global or planetary reality to science fiction, the Strugatsky brothers, who were the most influential and popular science fiction writers in the Soviet Union during the period of the new wave. And then we'll talk about the further development of anthologies, and we'll talk about science fiction cinema during the new wave. And I'll highlight out Stanley Kubrick, who was the premier creator of science fiction movies during that time. In fact, one of the premier creators of science fiction movies ever. And then I'm going to turn in much more depth to a focus on women in science fiction during the new wave. And I should just mention right off the bat that I think the most significant development that occurred in new wave science fiction in the late 60s and into the 70s was the emergence or rise of the woman voice and feminist perspective in science fiction. Now, there have been women writers before in science fiction, but in the late 60s and into the 70s, there was this incredible surge of really great science fiction writers who happen to be women: Ursula Gwen and Joanna Russ, Anne McCaffrey, and James Tiptree. And then we'll do a summary and conclusion at the end. Now, as I mentioned, I was going to begin with a story: psychology, gender, and science fiction. Back in the mid-1970s, I used to teach a course called Psychology and Science Fiction, back when I was first teaching psychology. I would pick out different science fiction stories that I would assign students to read that had various psychological themes, and we would discuss them. So I was attempting to try to teach psychology through science fiction. And one of the stories that I selected that I thought was a great story for revealing an awful lot about the psychology of desire and emotion and sex and instinct was a story called Love is the Plan is Death. And this story came out about mid-1970s. And in reading it, I really felt that whoever wrote this story had a really good understanding of psychology. Now, the person who wrote this story, the identified author, was James Tiptree Jr. And as it turned out, Tiptree had been publishing science fiction stories since the late 1960s, had corresponded with tons and tons of science fiction fans and science fiction writers, and no one had ever met this person. And just about the time that I was teaching this course, Tiptree also published another story called The Psychologist Who Wouldn't Do Awful Things to Rats. And being a graduate, graduate student in psychology and having a PhD in it, when I read that story, I thought, damn, Tiptree knows a lot more about psychology than the average everyday science fiction writer. There was stuff in that story, the second one in particular, that said to me, this person has a graduate education in psychology, whoever Tiptree was, and nobody knew who Tiptree was. And it was at that time that it became revealed, in fact, I think the year was 1977 to be precise, that James Tiptree Jr. was actually Alice Bradley Sheldon, a PhD in psychology who took on a male name to become a science fiction writer and had been hiding away behind her real identity with this fictitious name. And it hit me at that time that if Tiptree was a PhD in psychology, Alice Sheldon was a PhD in psychology, then maybe Alice Sheldon was in the American Psychological Association directory. And being a member of the American Psychological Directory, I looked up Alice Sheldon in the directory. And there was Alice Sheldon in the directory with Alice Sheldon's address in a suburb of Washington, D.C. And that fall, I went to a psychology conference in Washington, D.C., and unannounced, I rented a cab and had the cab drive me out to Alice Sheldon's house. And I knocked on the door. And this 6'6", very tall, thin character came to the door and told me that she wasn't at home, but that she was somewhere in the Yucatan. But undeterred, when I went home, I wrote Alice or Tiptree a letter. And when I come to the end of my presentation today, I'm going to tell you the rest of that story, because something happened after I wrote Tiptree that letter. And I forgot to mention here that up on the screen, you see this image of this strange insect-like creature who was Mugadit in the story, Love is the Plan is Death. And Mugadit has this sensual relationship with Lily Lou, who is the female of the species. And Mugadit falls madly in love with Lily Lou. And the story is this incredibly vivid, graphic vision of aliens getting it on, having sex, and in the end, Lily Lou feeds Mugadit to the babies. And Tiptree, or Alice Sheldon, was an amazing writer. And just to give you a sense of the graphic intensity of her writing and the lyrical nature of it, the opening lines from Love is the Plan is Death, are remembering. Do you hear my little red? Hold me softly, the cold grows. I remember, I am hugely black and hopeful. I bounce on 6 legs along the mountains in the new war. Sing the changer, sing the stranger. Will the changes change forever? All my hums have words now, another change. Eagerly I bound on sunward, following the tiny thrill in the air. The forests have been shrinking again. Then I see it is me myself, Magadit. I have grown bigger more in the winter cold. I astonish myself, Magadit the small. And that's how that story begins. And it's very lyrical, as I mentioned, and it's very graphic and sensual. And it really reveals a deep understanding of the way I took it was of basic animal psychology. And it's told from the perspective of Magadit, who is an alien. So we'll come back to Tiptree and gender and her writing when we come to the end, Alice Sheldon's writings. But to start in, even though the new wave emphasized psychological, cultural, social science fiction, during that period, there was a lot of really good, hard science fiction being written, involving aliens, wars, space operas, human evolution. And I wanted to highlight out three key, very influential, important writers who are probably in some ways more hard science fiction than traditional new wave, although not entirely. I'll explain that in a minute. But there were some important writers who played up old wave themes. And also, just to mention, before I get into those three, during the new wave, traditional science fiction writers from earlier were still publishing and were still producing a lot of really great stuff. Like Robert Heinlein was still writing in the 60s and 70s, Time Enough for Love, Isaac Asimov, The Gods Themselves, Fritz Leiber, Ship of Shadows, Jack Vance, The Last Castle, Arthur C. Clarke, 2001 and Rendezvous with Rama. All of these stories and novels won Hugos or won Nebulas during that time. Poul Anderson, who I talked about under the Silver Age, was amazingly popular during the 1960s and 70s, and either won awards or was nominated for awards, and wrote relatively hard science fiction. And then finally, Philip K. Dick, as I mentioned, bridged between the Silver Age and the new wave, writing in the late 1950s into the 60s and then into the 70s. And his stuff is often seen as representative of new wave, but it's just as much reflection of before. But Dick did get into a lot of psychological science fiction themes and issues about madness and the nature of reality. So there was a lot of stuff that was still going on by lots of writers from earlier on who were more old wave or traditional science fiction, but indeed were writing during the new wave. But as I said, I wanted to highlight out three people in particular, Frederick Pohl being the first one. Frederick Pohl, his history actually goes back to the beginnings of organized science fiction fandom in the 1930s, when he was a teenager, and he was one of the founding members of the Futurians. And Frederick Pohl became an accomplished editor of science fiction magazines. He collaborated with other science fiction writers through the 1950s and 1940s. In fact, there's a picture up there of Frederick Pohl when he was a young man with Donald Walheim, which I'll come back to later on. That was probably taken around 1940 or so. Frederick Pohl wrote a very good history of science fiction and science fiction fandom in the early days, the way the future was. But interestingly, and then finally I should mention, because I mentioned this novel before, with Kornbluth, he had written The Space Merchants back in the early 1950s during the Silver Age, which is considered one of the great science fiction novels of that period, which was a satire and a spoof and very prescient on commercialization and consumerism. back in the 1950s. And Pohl did get into writing comical stuff at times. But fascinatingly, Pohl only really came into his own as a great science fiction writer, although he'd been writing for a long time, in the late 1970s, when he published two novels, Man Plus and Gateway, both of which won Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year. Man Plus is, in one sense, hard science fiction because it has to do with technological augmentation of human beings, of creating cyborgs. But at the same time, it's very psychological too, because it takes place in a near future where humanity on the earth has pretty much obliterated any chances of being able to survive down here. And so the United States decides to construct a technologically augmented human that can survive on Mars. And little by little, this human is transformed into something that is rather alien, to say the least, as a viable species that could live on the planet Mars. And it's told from the perspective of the computer system which designs him. Little by little, he loses his sense of humanity, can't identify with humanity anymore, and is transformed into this different kind of mentality, this different kind of consciousness. And it bears upon the question that was emerging clearly at the time. If we technologically augment ourselves, we begin to change ourselves using technology, will we still be human? And Man Plus is a very good novel dealing with that question. Then 2 years later, he wrote what is usually considered his masterpiece, Gateway. And Gateway takes place in a hypothetical future where humanity has gone out into space and discovered the machinery of some vastly superior alien species that seems to have disappeared, but left a lot of its contraptions behind, including what is called the Gateway, which had lots of ships in it, where if you went into one of the ships, it would take you at faster than light speed to some other part of the universe. But humans could never figure out how the machinery worked, how the technology worked, and it involves a character who is sitting in a psychiatrist's office talking about the death of his wife due to these travels that they went on in these ships. But the psychiatrist, who's called Siegfried, is a computer. And it's a really great psychological story at the same time as being kind of space opera, outer space story. Frederik Pohl, in his short story, Day Million, depicts a love affair and a marriage between two people in the distant future, Day Million, who never meet each other in person, but have their whole relationship on virtual reality. So in the 1970s, and other ones that were great stories were The Gold at Starborough's End and Beyond the Blue Event Horizon and Gem. He wrote a lot of other things during that period, which were kind of a combination of hard science fiction and psychological themes as well, too. I always regret that at a World Future Society meeting, Pohl, who would interact with futurists and write for the Futurist magazine sometimes, gave a talk, and I wanted to go up and say hello to him, and I didn't do it for reasons I can't even fathom remember. But Pohl was a very good science fiction writer of that time, extremely so, and really came into his own, but had been around for like 50, 60 years writing science fiction. And so he didn't exactly fit into the stereotype of the new wave writer, but indeed he won lots of awards during that time. Now, to throw up some more art, this is a great piece of art by Michael Whelan, who is the most awarded artist in science fiction ever. Has won the Hugo more times than anybody else. And this is his painting for the cover of Larry Niven's The Integral Trees. And The Integral Trees was a novel that Larry Niven, who I'm going to be discussing now, wrote about a reality in which life evolves in a ring of gas that orbits a neutron star. And there is no surface or earth or terrain in this reality. It is a three-dimensional reality where there are these giant integral trees that stretch for hundreds of miles through this gaseous environment. It is a very inventive ecology, totally different, and humans come to this world and begin to evolve within it over a period of hundreds and hundreds of years. But I just wanted to show you the work of art, because indeed Whelan was a great artist, still is, and I thought this was one of his better paintings that he produced for a science fiction book cover, and it was a book cover for one of Larry Niven's novels, The Integral Trees. Now, Larry Niven emerged on the scene in the late 1960s, and for the first 10 years of his writing, he won lots of Hugos for lots of his stories and created a future history of humanity moving out into outer space, very high tech, very optimistic about technology, very optimistic about the development of space technologies, contacting aliens, and he developed indeed something similar to the kind of future history that Heinlein had done back 30 years ago. And it was called the Known Space Universe of Larry Niven. And a whole ton of his stories fit into this historical timeline that came together. This is from the book called Tales of Lone Space, and it just illustrates over a period of 1,200 years here, where Niven's various stories that he wrote and novels that he wrote during that initial period take place along this timeline. So Larry Niven created this future history of humanity, spacefaring humanity, that emphasizes hard science, won lots of awards, and was doing this during the new wave when people were talking about what's wrong with modern science and technology and industry and our Western notion of colonization and blah, 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 and all of that's all wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Larry Niven was indeed one of the most popular science fiction writers of the period, but hard science fiction. Now, Larry Niven, above everything else, is remembered for writing the novel Ringworld. And Ringworld is one of the stories in his history series of Tales of Known Space. And Ringworld takes place, I think, around 3100 AD, the time setting for Ringworld. And it won Best Novel of the Year and is clearly one of the most famous science fiction novels of that era, one of the best science fiction novels of that era, and it's rather hard science fiction. Now, what it's remembered for in particular is that Niven imagines that out in space, circling a distant star, is a 1 million mile wide band that loops around the star with a circumference of 600 million miles. It is his inventive elaboration of Olaf Stapleton's and Freeman Dyson's Dyson sphere, but it's a ring. And on the interior surface of the ring, which remember is 1 million miles across, is spread this amazingly rich surface area with biological life, botanical life, all different kinds of beings, all different kinds of enigmatic structures. And again, keep in mind, the ring is 600 million miles across. It was built by something and has disappeared, whoever built it. And 4 astronauts, 2 humans and 2 aliens, go to this ring to investigate it and crash on the interior of the ring and try to figure out how to get off. But while they're figuring out how to get off, they wander around through it, across it. Fascinatingly, if you are watching right now, the Mandalorian Boba Fett series on the Disney Channel, the new Mandalorian episode that came out this week has a ring world in it, where the Mandalorian is actually, during the first part of the story, on this ring world. But it's a much smaller ring world than what Larry Niven envisioned. What I found so cosmically elevating about Ringworld is the immensity of this structure made by these aliens, and the fact that the, and I had the number down here once, the surface area is so big that let's see, or is here someplace? Oh yes, I know it is. The surface area of Ringworld is equivalent to the surface area of 3 million Earths. So imagine a territory that vast and a structure that vast, and exploring it, trying to explore it. So it was a great novel of imagination. And as I mentioned earlier, The Integral Trees was a great novel of imagination involving how a biological, botanical kind of reality could emerge without a planetary surface, but in 3 dimensions, and various creatures who have evolved within that, and humans humans exploring it and evolving within it. Now, Larry Niven, after a certain point, began to partner with Jerry Purnell in the latter part of the 1970s into the 1980s. And the 2 of them wrote a lot of really good, interesting, hard science fiction. The Mote in God's Eye, about a great space opera with enigmatic aliens, and Lucifer's Hammer, about a comet hitting the Earth, one of the great disaster novels. And in fact, the 2 of them wrote a novel called Inferno, which is a scientific version of Dante's Inferno in the Divine Comedy. So Larry Niven was indeed an important science fiction writer during the New Wave, who was hard science fiction, really hard science fiction. Larry Niven really knew his technology and physical science and wrote a lot of very popular stuff during that time. Now, the next one I'm going to turn to, the third one here, a great, more hard science fiction during the New Wave was Joe Haldeman. Now, Joe Haldeman sort of bridges New Wave and Old Wave in certain ways, because Haldeman wrote about future military weapons, wars with aliens, various kinds of wars on Earth, all of which are part of, traditional science fiction. But he did it in a different kind of way. And in fact, in the 1970s, and I've already mentioned Ringworld is another great novel of the 70s, Haldeman wrote one of the most popular science fiction novels, one of the best, in my opinion, of the 1970s, The Forever War. Haldeman was a Vietnam vet, and he was wounded in the Vietnam War. And he came back to the US and started to write science fiction. And within a couple of years, he wrote The Forever War, which Robert Heinlein, who of course wrote Starship Troopers, the famous military science fiction story of the late 1950s, Heinlein presumably said that the best novel of future war ever written in science fiction was The Forever War. And The Forever War was an unromantic vision of war, written by a Vietnam vet. And it ended up winning the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locus Awards. And it tells the story of a guy who is intelligent as opposed to a dumb brute, who's drafted into a war that begins right at the tail end of the 20th century and ends up being in a war that lasts 1,000 years. And the reason why he could live through the whole thing is that he has to be transported to the battle areas where humanity is fighting this alien. And while he's being transported, he goes into a state of stasis and he doesn't age. So even though he, from his point of view, lives a normal life, from the perspective of Earth history, this war goes on for 1,000 years and he lives for 1,000 years. And the Forever War, to get a feel of it, begins the following way. These are the opening lines. Tonight, we're going to show you 8 silent ways to kill a man. The guy who said that was a sergeant who didn't look 5 years older than me. So if he had ever killed a man in combat, silently or otherwise, he'd done it as an infant. I already knew 80 ways to kill people, but most of them were pretty noisy. And so we have this rather satirical, unenthusiastic, intelligent guy who gets drafted into a war fighting aliens, jumps back and forth between the Earth and some alien realm over a 1,000-year period. Every time he goes on leave, you know what he does? He has sex and smokes pot. He eventually lives so long that his soldiers that he eventually becomes a commander of, due to various policy changes on the Earth to curb overpopulation, are all homosexual guys. And he feels alienated from them, as he feels alienated from the Earth every time he goes back. It turns into a very bleak and realistic and dark vision of the nature of war. Because after 1,000 years, what they find out is that the war going on between them and these aliens was based on a misunderstanding. So it's a futile war. It's a critique on the Vietnam War. And in that sense, it is representative of New Wave thinking, because indeed, Haldeman saw the Vietnam War as a pointless war, and this turns into a pointless war. It's very, very funny, very humanistic, and I wouldn't even tell you how the whole thing ends, but it's a great, great novel, one of the best science fiction novels about the war in the future. Forever Peace, which was written a lot later, is actually, I think, almost as good a novel about a way that military technology finally figures out a way to stop wars, but they're in a race with a bunch of fundamentalist Christians who want to obliterate the universe and bring about the great prophecies of the Bible, the end of time, using modern science. So highly recommended, both of them, The Forever War and Forever Peace, written much later. And Haldeman wrote a lot of other stuff. He was eventually inaugurated into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. He's a Grand Master. He's still alive, but he was definitely a really great writer during the New Wave period. Now, next writer who I'll come to, here's a quote from him, R.A. Lafferty. "We must kill the devil afresh every day." And Lafferty was a strange character, even for New Wave writing. I have up here another quote by him. "Learn the true topography. The monstrous and wonderful archetypes are not inside you, not inside your consciousness. You are inside them, trapped and howling to get out." Oops. Sometimes my little clicker doesn't work. And Lafferty only entered into writing science fiction when he was in his 40s. And people in New Wave circles wanted to identify him as being a New Wave writer, but he was so peculiar in the way he wrote and the kinds of stories that he wrote, it would be hard to classify him as anything except for the fact that he indeed, whoops, I lost my, okay, oops, there we go, okay. That he was a very popular writer of that period. And just to give you a sample, he wrote primarily short stories. And the first one I mentioned here, the title of it is Hog Belly Honey. And it's about a stupid man who can't learn to do anything, and he keeps making machines to do everything for him. And it's a critique on our technological reality that we live in today, where we keep getting machines to do things for us instead of learning how to do them ourselves. And another one was 900 Grandmothers, about a man looking for the ultimate source of everything by interrogating aliens who keep getting tinier and tinier in size. And thus we frustrate Charlemagne about a bunch of people who have a time machine and keep going back and trying to change history and keep making history worse. And as a spoof on the world as will in wallpaper, we find a man who lives in a world where when he travels east or west, that reality keeps repeating itself over and over again, like he lives in wallpaper. And as I mentioned, Lafferty was very peculiar in his prose and his thinking, and was very, very popular. And it would be hard to classify him everywhere, but I really wanted to mention him because indeed he was a really great writer of short stories during the New Wave period. I want to turn to David Gerrold. And David Gerrold I've met. I met David Gerrold a few years ago. And people will be familiar with David Gerrold because his first claim to fame was that he wrote the Star Trek episode, The Trouble with Tribbles, back in the late 1960s. In fact, he wrote a whole bunch of scripts for Star Trek and finally sold one, The Trouble with Tribbles. And he eventually wrote a book on that episode and all the trouble that they had in producing it. And then he wrote another book, The World of Star Trek, which he writes about the whole nature of the production of Star Trek. And he wrote lots of scripts for other TV series during the 60s and 70s. And he wrote a novel called The Martian Child, which was about a man who adopted a son, and the son told him that he was a Martian. And they eventually made that into a movie. And presumably it's rather autobiographically based because Gerrold indeed did adopt a son as a single male. I think he was single. But he also wrote some a good science fiction, When Harley Was One, about a computer that becomes conscious and has this extended discussion with his creator because the company that's created the computer wants to turn Harley off, and Harley doesn't want to die. And it's a good novel regarding, can a computer be conscious? how would a computer think its situation out, its reality out? In fact, if it was, would it see itself as a person? Would it want to stay alive? But I think that unequivocally, and the reason why I have Gerald up here is David Gerald wrote The Man Who Folded Himself. And The Man Who Folded Himself is such an incredibly unique science fiction novel, and it in no way whatsoever connects or was presaged by anything else that was up there. And it's about a young guy who is an uncle, and this uncle gives him a belt and gives him a manuscript in a box. And the belt is a time machine. And the man eventually decides, after the uncle dies of old age, to put on the belt. And the man starts traveling through time. The novel begins with the line, "In a box was a belt and the following manuscript." And then you read the manuscript that was in the box. And the novel ends with, "I'm going to put on the belt." But the manuscript describes what this young guy reads. And this is going to become a mental looper of the nth degree as far as time travel goes. Because as the man who has this box is reading the story, what he reads is that the uncle, as a young man, was given a belt by his old uncle, and he started to go travel through time where he meets different versions of himself at different points in time, makes lots of money because he can anticipate who's going to win at the horse races and other things, plays cards with 4 or 5 different versions of himself, starts traveling backwards in time, eventually meets up with a female version of himself, and they have a child between them. Although on one timeline, the child is a girl, on another timeline, the child is a boy. The woman disappears with the girl child. The man disappears with the boy child and comes up to the present and tells the boy child that he is his uncle, who is indeed the character who's writing the story. But it's also the boy too. So what David Gerald is able to achieve in 150 pages is a time travel story in which the same person turns out to be his mother, his father, himself, his daughter, and his son. And so if you remember Robert Heinlein's All You Zombies, this goes a bit step further than that, because this involves a total loop all the way around in time travel. And I remember being totally enthralled with this novel when I first read it. You could read it in an afternoon, but it will set your head spinning in terms of the metaphysics of reality, and how could somebody achieve this kind of looping of and pulling himself up by his own bootstraps within a time machine. Oops. Okay. Oops. We somehow got, pardon me, we went backwards as opposed to forwards. Okay, here we are. You hit the wrong button and you don't know where you end up. I just looped around. Another really great, interesting, hard science fiction novel written during that time was by Christopher Priest. And the novel, The Inverted World, begins with the line, "I have reached the age of 650 miles." And I have two different pictures of Priest up there when he was a young hippie, and then a more present picture of him today. The Inverted World is considered to be one of the great science fiction novels of the 1970s, and it takes place on this city that moves across this terrain on tracks. And the people who live in the city keep pulling up the tracks behind them and putting them down in front of them and moving the city along. You can get off of this moving city if you want and explore the land around you, but there are certain strange things about the land around you, because if you start going to the south from the direction you came, time slows down and everything gets increasingly flatter and flatter. If you go forward, walking along where the city is heading, time seems to speed up and everything gets skinnier and more elongated. And when you look up in the sky, and I have the image up here, the sun up above is this odd shaped sun. And the whole thing here is this great mystery. What the hell is going on here? What kind of a reality is this that these people are living? And they have to keep laying down tracks, and they have to keep moving the city forward at 1/10 of a mile a day. And I won't give away the ending of it, because the setting of it is enough to interest people, in that it's a very enigmatic and bizarre reality, very inventive reality created by Christopher Priest. And Christopher Priest, over the coming decades, would write The Prestige, which they made into a movie. He wrote the novel for Existence, which became a movie as well. And he also wrote a book called The Book on the Edge of Forever, in which he lambasts Harlan Ellison when Harlan Ellison never seemed to get around to writing The Final Dangerous Visions. But Priest was another one who wrote a really great novel, sort of more hard science fiction than not, during the period of the New Wave, and highly recommend The Inverted World. Now, at this point, I'm going to come to the Strugatsky brothers, but as a lead-in, I'd recommend that if you're interested in seeing what was going on in Eastern European and Russian science fiction during the early decades of the 20th century up through the 1970s and 80s, the Illustrated History of Science Fiction, which has an Eastern European, Dieter Walkel, who co-wrote it, is a really good description of the 50-year period from the time of the rise of communism up to the 1960s and 70s. And Isaac Asimov edited a couple books of anthologies on Soviet science fiction. But the writers, as I mentioned earlier, who were the premier Soviet writers during this time, were Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, who were brothers. And they were writing science fiction, for 20, 30 years together. The novel that they became famous for in the West was Roadside Picnic, which they made into a movie, Stalker. The movie Stalker is boring as hell, excuse me, but the novel is great. And Roadside Picnic takes place in a relatively near future in which we have a character who lives near this area that apparently has been visited by aliens. And these aliens have left various artifacts scattered about, and humans can't seem to figure out what these artifacts do, but they're highly valued. And people go into this area to try to steal alien artifacts, but the area is guarded by the government. And we have this gentleman who is hired by people who want to go in there and clandestinely steal something that's an alien artifact because of the fact that they're considered so valuable. Now, the term Roadside Picnic, the top title of the novel, is due to the fact that one popular explanation of what went on here is that aliens had stopped over for an evening, had a picnic on the Earth, 6 different places, threw away their garbage, and left and never told the humans anything about it. And humans never saw them. And so it's a very kind of comical but bleak and dark novel. And I highly recommend it. I wouldn't recommend watching the movie. And the Strugatsky brothers were very popular writers in the Soviet Union. So while things are going on in Great Britain and the United States, things were going on across the ocean in the Soviet Union too. And as the Strugatsky brothers wrote over a period of 20, 30 years, their novels became increasingly bleak. They were very optimistic about the possibilities of a great future human reality, which which over time they lost their sense of optimism. And it's that kind of sense of optimism that maybe the new wave writers lost with respect to the traditional view of Western civilization and science and technology being able to create a better future in the future. So they sort of fit in with the new wave, and Roadside Picnic has that feel. I just wanted to mention that in the 1960s, science fiction was becoming increasingly self-conscious and both coming out with anthologies every year, identifying the best science fiction of the year, original anthologies like Universe and Orbit. Up here are Donald Wollheim and Terry Carr and Damon Knight, who did Orbit. And then also Ballantine was producing the best of different science fiction writers, which I highly recommend. Those came out in the 1960s and 70s, where you get a sampling of what the editors have decided are the best science fiction stories of different popular science fiction writers. Up here is one of my favorite paintings for a science fiction book cover, Universe 5, with the statues and the one with the cat's head there. By the way, the cat will appear again today too in another one. But that was a great painting by Patrick Woodruff for Universe 5. So lots of anthologies were getting written during that time. Now, here we have an infamous science fiction character, Barbarella. And I wanted to turn now to science fiction movements. And I'm looking at the time, and I definitely want to give enough time for the second half today. But science fiction movies definitely evolved in the 1960s. One of the most popular ones was Planet of the Apes, which people probably saw. Jambor, who is on today, really liked Zardoz, which was kind of new age science fiction. George Lucas did his first full-length movie, THX 1138. A Boy and His Dog was produced, Harlan Ellison's story. If you've never seen it, very fantastical in lots of ways. Fantastic Planet, a French movie, cartoon, science fiction, great imagination. If you've never seen it, highly recommend it. Comical science fiction like Sleeper, Woody Allen. 2 Ray Bradbury novels were cinematized, Fahrenheit 451 and The Illustrated Man. Both of them are very good movies too. Rollerball, Soylent Green, both based on Harry Harrison novels. The Man Who Fell to Earth, The Forbid Project, about a supercomputer that decides it's going to take over control of humanity, and Isaac Asimov's Fantastic Voyage, and The Stepford Wives, which of course was a rather spooky vision of a possible reality in which males created robotic wives who were subservient, and it was a critique, a feminist critique, so to speak, on males wanting wives who were nothing but robots and didn't think for themselves. So there was a lot of inventive science fiction going on, science fiction cinema.
Tom.
Yes.
Tom, you're muted.
I'm unmuted. I'm
Okay.
unmuted now. Yes. Okay, I noticed that. But the really great producer of science fiction cinema during the new wave was Stanley Kubrick. I list Dr. Strangelove as science fiction. And I listed as science fiction because indeed, in it, we start World War III, which is in fact the final war because we blow ourselves up and have to go underground. It's comical, it's satire, it's psychological. The characters in it are incredibly funny. You could have funny science fiction. You could have psychological science fiction. Sterling Hayden is great as the crazy colonel who sends the whole thing going. And Peter Sellers is great as Dr. Strangelove, Dr. Strangelove being an ex-Nazi with a robotic arm that he can't control. And it's clearly, yes, and Jeannie's raising her arm. It's clearly one of the great movies of that period. But then Kubrick outdid himself. And by the way, one other thing about Strangelove note is there's lots of music in it too. And Kubrick was big with music, in particular classical music. 2001 was, in one sense, classic science fiction, but it ends psychedelically. It ends mystically. It ends symbolically. And the first time I went to see it, I didn't even understand the ending because I hadn't read the book yet. But it's usually considered one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made, except that I would say Clockwork Orange was a better one, even though it's a totally different kind of movie. And just like 2001 has classical music in it as being a key element, because 2001 is an artistic creation, always around, Clockwork Orange has classical music in it, in particular Beethoven, who somehow gets associated with rape and violence. And Clockwork Orange is psychologically very deep because indeed it's a story having to do with the issue of free will and good and evil. And to what degrees do we go to try to control our population? It is very violent and upsetting that first 30 minutes. And it is the kind of movie that could never have been made 10 years earlier. It definitely is a movie which could exist because of shifting cultural values, and that you could have nudity and vulgarity and hideous scenes up on the screen, which you couldn't have done 10 years earlier. And the end of it is very enigmatic because in the end, he's sitting there, the main character, having had the conditioning done to him undone with that evil but kind of crazy dazed look in his eyes as he's listening to Beethoven again. And I could spend an hour talking about Clockwork Orange, but I want to give the second half of this enough time. So, but I just want to mention that Kubrick produced 3 great science fiction movies during the New Wave period. And then he also produced, and I have up here on the screen, The Shining a little bit later, which is not science fiction, but rather horror and more fantasy than anything. But it was another great work of art. And Kubrick was very good at creating works of art up on the screen. And 2001, even if it is in one sense a story written by a hard science fiction writer, but with mystical elements, Arthur C. Clarke, the ending of it is best viewed stoned. The 15 minutes toward the end of it where he goes into the space warp. It was made for that. So it definitely fits into the period of the time. Now, that's a good place to take a 5-minute break because we're going to go on to the next part of the presentation on women in science fiction, but I think we should take a 5-minute break and stop sharing. I'm going to